And we begin with a WSFA 12 News investigation tonight of Alabama's Parole Board.
The board has released nearly 200 inmates in just the past month, and there are concerns that some of them will reoffend.
District attorneys raising those concerns, and that prompted our investigation. What we found, the Parole Board has very little governance, and except for capital cases and split sentences, can do whatever it pleases. Here's Jennifer Horton with the story you'll see only on 12.
It took them less than a minute to make this decision.
Montgomery District Attorney Daryl Bailey was stunned when the Board of Pardons and Paroles released Markel Sweeting, who'd served only 6 years of a 25-year sentence.
3 people, 3 Montgomery citizens, had a gun put to their head and were robbed of their property. One of them was shot and almost had their life taken away from them. And here we are 5 years later with a man back out who did these things walking the streets.
Sweeting pleaded guilty to 3 counts of robbery and assault. Behind bars, he had multiple disciplinaries, including assaulting a corrections officer. Board rules and procedures state inmates convicted of a Class A felony must serve 85% of their sentence or 15 years, whichever comes first, to be considered for parole. In this case, Sweeting came up for parole 9 years early.
It's a fraud on the whole system. I mean, you have the judges who expect when they sentence someone to 25 years, multiple 25-year sentences, they expect the person to be in prison for a long time.
Bailey believes paroling inmates like Sweeting is feeding our violent crime problem.
This is the type of decisions that they're making. I'm calling on the governor of the state of Alabama to replace them and to replace them quickly.
Our research revealed Bailey isn't alone. The statewide group Victims of Crime and Leniency, or VOCAL, whose mission is keeping violent offenders in prison, says they're deeply concerned.
And they are paroling violent offenders every day.
And many of those inmates are coming up for parole early. Generally, board procedures state most inmates are not eligible for parole unless they've served 1/3 of their sentence or 10 years, whichever comes first. VOCAL Executive Director Jeanette Grantham says the board isn't following their own regulations.
Here is a stack of inmates who's going to be up for parole next month. She's got 235 years consecutive. You can't get much higher than that. And she serves, this one has served 9 years, 11 months, and 22 days. She has not served 1/3 or 10 years. This one right here has got 2 consecutive life sentences, and she served 6 years, 1 month, and 29 days.
In 2016, we spoke with Freddie McCarthy after 2 people pleaded guilty to gunning down his daughter in Montgomery.
Just hope that these people, they will be able to give them enough time where they would never ever get out and they'd never have an opportunity to hurt anybody else.
Both offenders were sentenced to life for murder. We spoke with McCarthy again, who brought this notice showing one of the offenders is up for parole in only 3 weeks.
Victims should not have to go down there and beg for mercy.
We went through the sentences for the more than 150 inmates paroled in September. Charlie Garrett paroled after serving 15 years of a life sentence for murder. Frederick Peoples, who served 16 years of 2 consecutive life sentences, was also granted parole. Rondrell Wheeler paroled after 19 years for 2 consecutive life sentences. While it fits the board's parole consideration date, Grantham says it's not long enough.
They got a sentence in court, but it doesn't mean anything. When it gets to Montgomery before that parole board, I mean, you just as well throw out what the judge and the court and the jury said. When we get to where a life in the state of Alabama is not worth a 5-year, 6-year sentence, then what have we become?
The Board of Pardons and Paroles issued a statement saying they do not have data showing a dramatic increase in violent inmates considered for parole prior to their original set date, but they're open to analyze numbers of other agencies who believe they have that data. And Mark, we spoke to the governor's office. She says she's very concerned. She's monitoring the board and plans to meet with them later this month.
All right, Jennifer, thank you. And we know you have a second installment to this investigation coming up tonight at 10 o'clock, so we encourage you to join us then. VOCAL will talk about the changes that they are proposing to the state law that requires victims of crime be notified when a parolee ends up missing. Find out why they believe this system is broken tonight at 10. Too many criminals are being paroled too soon. That's the concern tonight of DAs and victims' rights advocates across Alabama.
Earlier at 6, we showed you our investigation into recent decisions by the Board of Pardons and Paroles, revealing nearly 200 early releases in just the last month. Tonight, reporter Jennifer Horton continues her report with a look at what happens after those inmates are paroled and why victim advocates say it's putting your family's safety at risk. It's a story you'll see only on 12.
The Board of Pardons and Paroles released nearly 200 inmates in September, some considered violent offenders sentenced to life in prison.
Every violent offender they released is going to go into some neighborhood and they going to live next door to somebody. And they released one last month that stabbed his victim 27 times and slit her throat.
Jeanette Grantham is the state director for Victims of Crime and Leniency, or VOCAL. She says the board has blood on their hands after an incident earlier this year involving parolee Jimmy O'Neill Spencer, who spent the greater part of his life in prison.
He was listed as low to medium risk of reoffending.
Spencer's victims weren't notified. He was paroled to the Jimmy Hill Mission and walked away weeks later. He was in the wind for 5 months before reportedly murdering 3 people in Marshall County. Grantham says the board never put out an alert or warrant for Spencer.
He came in contact with the law 2 separate times. Law enforcement says they notified the parole board. He was actually in court in Marshall County that morning. They contacted the parole board and by someone was told no comment. That day, they found the 3 bodies, including the little 7-year-old boy.
In August, Board Executive Director Eddie Cook called the murders unfortunate.
He made this choice, okay? The board didn't do anything wrong in the parole, okay? The police officers didn't do anything wrong. This is a conscious decision he made.
Grantham disagrees, and she's taking action, drafting a bill that would require the board to instantly notify law enforcement and the public of a parolee's disappearance.
If we had that law then, those people would be alive today.
As we're categorizing Spencer as unlikely to reoffend,
We have no way of knowing if they've done anything to prevent this from happening again. We have to protect our victims. We should have protected 7-year-old Colton Lee, but we didn't.
the bill is in the early stages, but is expected to be taken up in the next legislative session. Jennifer Horton, WSFA 12 News.
The Board of Pardons and Paroles believes their assessment tool is making a difference in the parole process. As for the early release of violent inmates, the board says it has no data to back up those claims. You can read the whole investigation right now on WSFA.com. Violent criminals paroled before their time. An update tonight in an ongoing WSFA 12 News investigation.
At issue, the sheer number of criminals being paroled in Alabama, many of them having only served a small percentage of their overall sentence.
Our first report appears to have prompted changes to the parole board's docket. There are now fewer inmates on the list. WSFA 12 News reporter Jennifer Horton takes a closer look and talks to the families of crime victims in a story you'll see only on 12.
At first glance, the number of inmates serving life sentences for murder on the October parole docket was staggering. Some were sentenced to life in prison within the last 5 years. We heard from one victim whose brother was stabbed multiple times, shot to death, rolled up in a rug, and left on the side of the road. The defendant was up for parole next week. They'd only served 6 years of a life sentence. Other victims, like Freddie McCarthy, introduced in our first investigation, received notice of possible parole only 2 years after a defendant was sentenced to life for his daughter's murder. They asked for our help, and we quickly began pulling criminal histories of the 551 inmates up for parole this month. Days after launching a second investigation, we discovered the board's October docket had been modified. The original list now replaced with a new docket with 47 fewer names without notice. A comparison showed nearly all those removed were in prison for murder. 32 of those inmates were removed from the first parole docket of the month, which is coincidentally the day after the board is scheduled to meet with the governor and attorney general.
It's like living a nightmare, and then it just keeps on going on. It's just, you get the sequel.
That sequel came late Tuesday afternoon. McCarthy received a call that the inmate serving time for his daughter's death had been pulled from the docket.
I thought actually it was a prank call.
4 weeks he's been emotionally preparing to protest Dominique Atkinson's early release. The next day he called the board back just to be sure. When he asked why,
They couldn't talk about it. She couldn't say.
So we contacted the board, who confirmed the names were pulled by the executive director for further review, and all parties are in the process of being notified. McCarthy still believes there's more to it.
I don't think it was a mistake. It feels like I'm being punished. And it punished the family more so than the people that commit the crime.
We combed over that new docket, and based on board guidelines, around 100 violent inmates are still up for early parole. Val?
All right, thanks a lot, Jennifer. Now, the board told us the inmates removed from the docket will be reset back to their original parole consideration date. We asked for more information about those dates, but we haven't heard back.
Governor Ivey taking unprecedented action, ordering a temporary freeze on all early parole hearings involving violent inmates.
This action comes after our investigation revealed hundreds of violent inmates were up for early parole this month. Following our reports, we revealed the board removed 50 violent offenders from the hearings without notice. Jennifer Horton has the latest developments.
The governor's executive order is clear. The board docketed hundreds of violent inmates for early parole, posing a threat to public safety and a general lack of agency oversight. Following an hour-long meeting with the Board of Pardons and Paroles, no straight answers on why the inmates were on the docket.
We addressed that question with them extensively, and like I say, I was disappointed with the answers that we got.
We went through very specific examples with them today from the most recent docket of people that had 7 or 8 years and were on life sentences for murder that were coming up, and that simply is unacceptable.
Prior to the governor's executive order, there were 9 inmates on the docket this week, all serving life sentences. All of them had been in prison for less than 15 years. 2 of those serving back-to-back life sentences.
I told them that we were going to stop that today with this moratorium, and it stopped.
The order gives the board 30 days to develop a corrective action plan, which must be approved by the governor and AG and implemented in the next 75 days.
Reducing prison overcrowding is not their call.
I just think it's a good day.
Vocal Executive Director Jeanette Grantham feared the outcome of October's dockets and what it could mean for victims of violent crime.
We won't have to worry about them. Those victims can get a good night's sleep tonight. I think the parole board knows now that something's got to change.
The first parole hearing of the month is slated for Tuesday, a docket that's dropped from 86 inmates to 54. Following today's order, it's now down to around 30 defendants. Jennifer Horton, WSFA 12 News.
The governor also addressed the case of inmate Jimmy Spencer, who's accused of murdering 3 people this year following his early release from prison. She cited a lack of supervision and gained little insight today on why he was paroled. You can read our extensive investigation right now on WSFA.com. WSFA 12 News broke the story. Alabama's parole board abruptly cancels all hearings for the week, a surprise to many.
Governor Kay Ivey had ordered the cancellation of early parole hearings for violent offenders following a WSFA 12 News investigation. But even the governor questioned the board's decision to cancel all hearings, even for those legitimately eligible for parole. Several attorneys and crime victims showed up this morning only to learn their hearings would not be held. Reporter Jennifer Horton now with the latest developments.
The first parole docket of the month slated for 9 a.m. Those who plan to attend met with this cancellation notice and locked doors.
It has upset people on both sides.
The board says they canceled the 3 dockets this week to pull files and ensure they're in compliance with the governor's executive order. While some felt they're taking the appropriate action, it didn't sit well with Lakeisha Billingsley and Selena Ford, who drove for hours to attend.
We waited a long time for this moment. You know, I really had tears in my eyes. I had to regroup myself.
Their family member was eligible for parole. It was the first time he's been scheduled for a hearing.
The inmates did not set these dates. They set these dates.
I'm close to tearing up right now, honestly.
Sierra Wingate drove in from Dothan this morning to advocate for her mother's release.
We're just not going to know if she's going to be able to get out.
Victim advocacy groups who showed up in full force were also caught off guard.
We had a group that came from Georgia. They drove all night to get here.
Our investigation identified around 30 of the initial 84 inmates on today's docket that were eligible for a hearing.
I don't think the 3 members of the board necessarily is all of the problem. I think it is more under that.
The governor was critical of the move, stating it wasn't what she called for, citing unsound reasoning. No word when the cases from this week's dockets will be reassigned. Jennifer Horton, WSFA 12 News.